So welcome everybody to our continuation of this course, To Thine Own Self Be True. Various mystical and religious traditions teach about spiritual experience. And while all religions have taught from their founders the direct communion of the consciousness or the soul with divinity, many people in our modern era refute or criticize the potential or possibility for individuals like us to have that same experience. Unfortunately, this is a form of ignorance and one that misses the point of the inception of these great traditions. Primarily because these religious figures like Moses, Buddha, Jesus, and many prophets or luminaries of humanity all taught that we have the potential to experience these things for ourselves. What's important is to have the willingness and the openness to test and to experiment, to verify what religions have called divinity, no matter the name, culture, time, or place. But unfortunately, despite the beauty of these great religions and the practical and ethical import that they convey, many take these forms of traditions and knowledge at face value as if they are something external. In fact, what they teach is the internal life of the true human being who completely awakens and develops their full potential. A true human being is one who is in full communion with their true self. And that true self, as we've explained in this tradition, is divinity. Divinity is not outside, but is inside. It is important to reflect on the religious symbolism of great teachings, scriptures, and knowledge, because they reflect something about ourselves. If we have the wherewithal, the means, or the interest to explore this fact. So all these religions, like as you see in this image of a church, convey great depth and beauty. What they really offer for the soul is a mirror to see ourselves, to see who we really are, our true identity. This is our innate truth, the real fundamental part of who we are, which is not tainted or contaminated by afflictions, states of suffering, egotism, desire. Or, as we use in this tradition, the term ego, which is Latin for I, for self. That is not the true self we are talking about. We're talking about a state of being in which there is no impurity or affliction, a state of consciousness, our real, authentic identity. But we often do not recall or understand what this state is in ourselves, how to access it, how to cultivate it. This is primarily what we'll do in this lecture. We will define, describe, and demonstrate what it means to remember the true self, as explained to the Gnostic tradition of Sama and Vior. We will also clarify misconceptions about the nature of divine remembrance, what it is, how it pertains to the present moment, who we are now, not in some distant future or a memory of a remote past, but a state of being that is fully immersive, expansive, and integral here and now. We will also identify the difficulties and dangers, oftentimes the discouragement experienced by practitioners of diverse traditions who want to know the truth within themselves, what divinity is. And likewise, we'll present some antidotes for how to address the challenges of this spiritual work, the path of remembering our real identity amidst the challenges and confusion, the conflicts, even within our own mind. We'll also explain practically how to integrate techniques we explained previously: self-observation, mindfulness, awareness, perception, with the state of remembering the self so as to advance on this spiritual path. It'd be useful to examine some etymology about this term of remembrance. From the Middle English remembren, the Old French remembrer, to remember. Likewise, the Latin re, which means again, and the late Latin memorare, to be mindful of, from the Latin memor, mindful or memory. There's also the late Latin rememorare, to remember again, from the re, memor, mindful. These etymologies emphasize a state of being. But unfortunately, in our conventional parlance, the term memory has many associations that are often subjective and do not really convey the spiritual depth of these deeper truths. What we want is not to nostalgically immerse ourselves in the memory of some foregone past, perhaps in our childhood or youth, when perhaps we did not suffer so much. The state of remembrance that we are talking about has to do with recalling a state of being, because psychologically, who we are in the moment constitutes our reality, and how we respond internally to the stimuli of life is how we qualify our particular level of being, or better said, our authentic spirituality or lack thereof. This remembrance involves a state of perception. We've talked about self-observation, in which we are, as a consciousness, as an essence, examining the contents of our psychology, whether it be through our thoughts, feelings, and body, mind, heart, and physicality. This is one step of spiritual development, a technique. Self-observation is necessary to discover ourselves, to watch the contents of our mind when we face diverse circumstances, to remember the self, the real self, is precisely to maintain that vigilance moment by moment. It is to remember the state of consciousness that is not identified with egotistical desires like pride and anger, fear, laziness, and lust, egos, as we explained previously, defects, imperfections, or contaminants of mind. Self-remembrance is to remember, to evoke, to recall a state of consciousness in which the most virtuous aspects of who we are manifest spontaneously, freely, unimpededly, and profoundly. It is not a matter of thinking. It's not an intellectual process. While we think of the word remember or remembrance from the Proto-Indo-European mer, to think about, to be mindful, to remember, what we're talking about is a state of consciousness that is not determined by thought. It is the perception that examines thought. And it is the focal point, the crux, the crucible in our psychology, in which we learn to refine our purest sentiments. It's more of an emotional, superior quality, to remember virtuous states of being, so that our actions, our thoughts, our mood, our body is at service of the spirit. We use the term spirit in this context to reference divinity, the real truth within a human being, the divine. That spirit does not mix with our impurity or with our personality, our face, our language, our culture, our name, our habits, our biases, our political beliefs. Divinity is transcendent of that. And to remember that state of being is precisely to manifest the best qualities that we have within. Compassion, selflessness, altruism, faith or knowledge from experience, patience and endurance within hardship, love and sacrifice. The most noblest ideals we find within the founders of humanity's great traditions, all synthesized and manifest within a human being. The compassion of millions of mothers towards their children. That is the strength and power of divinity, and which is a state of being that we can recall and remember, although we have conditioned ourselves greatly due to our mistaken habits. The term remember also is interesting etymologically, relating to the Latin root membrum, which is a part or limb of the body. This is very interesting. Self-remembrance as a state of consciousness is almost a reconstitution of our authentic self, who we were in the past, before division and conflict and discord. To put back the limbs of the body of divinity, to reunite the parts of our consciousness, our essence, as we said previously, the term for soul in our tradition, that is trapped in ego. All of our defects, like pride and anger, our mistaken senses of self, are what condition and cage our soul. And the essence must be freed from all of that. We must break the shells of desire, of anger and pride, vanity and lust, so that the pure soul can be liberated from it and reintegrated back with divinity. This is also what it means to remember, but it's a long work. It's a patient process. We also state that remembrance of the spirit is precisely our inner intuition, our intuitive knowledge, our knowing without having to think. It is a quality of the heart in which we feel more connected with virtuous qualities of being. Really, a proper psychological state in life is perhaps the greatest weapon we can ever wield when we are faced with hardship and ordeals, situations and circumstances that would break normal people. There are ways to cultivate happiness, giving, serenity, even during torture, as is emphasized by the lives of the great martyrs. It is a state of being that is possible for us, but one that requires prudence, as well as a lot of work. Salomon Vior, the founder of the modern Gnostic tradition, emphasized a very beautiful teaching in his book, Treatise of Revolutionary Psychology, where he emphasizes how our inner psychology determines our way of life. And by remembering a proper state of being, we can navigate the great chaos and complexities of life. This is the state of self-remembrance. The best weapon that a human being can use in life is a correct psychological state. Even the mystics of Islam, the Sufis, taught in some ancient scriptures, such as Al-Risala, Principles of Sufism, that remembrance of God is the sword of the seekers. With it, one deters bad circumstances. It's the same teaching. In the path of self-remembrance, we also cultivate what's known as a work memory. But this type of memory is not mechanical. It is not associative in the sense that we think of it now. Usually we think of memory as related to recalling what we ate for breakfast, or having an association in the mind that A relates to B. It doesn't really take much effort. Oftentimes memories come to us without thinking or without willing it. They simply appear. We call this reverie, daydreaming, reminiscing. And oftentimes it constitutes a psychological state of sleep. We're not really actively willing these states of perception to come to arrive. They come to us. And while memory in the practical conventional sense in life is necessary, it has a utility. We need memory to be able to subsist in life, to be able to pay our bills, to know where to drive our car, to know what to put on a resume. These are all useful and necessary. But there is a spiritual type of memory which is very different, and is characterized by the Greek goddess Mnemosyne. This Greek goddess Mnemosyne is the goddess of memory, but not memory of the intellect, memory of the heart. Her mythology, or her story, her genesis, conveys some very deep truths for us in relation to this topic that I like to relate. She's the goddess of memory, a titaness, meaning a great giant or figure of power and ability. Daughter of Uranos and Gaia. Uranos is the god of heaven. Gaia is the goddess of the earth. What's interesting is that she is a daughter of both heaven and earth, emphasizes the practical utility of work memory. Work memory, specifically spiritual memory, is the knowledge and data stored within the essence, the soul, when that soul is awakening and working. The type of memory I'm talking about has to do with perhaps spiritual experiences, one in which you actively navigate the superior dimensions of nature, such as in dreams, knowledge that you retain from the internal worlds. It also relates to knowledge of yourself. When you've comprehended certain defects, a different ego, perhaps like anger, you understand its mechanisms, its thought processes, its movements in the body, its food, the way it feeds, the way it acts, and what series of defects do these egos or specific ego manifest. There's a whole complex range of data ascertained by the consciousness that is observing the facts. And as we're studying ourselves, meaning our centers, like our mind, heart, and body, we are developing spiritual work memory. We're remembering what we really need to know to walk effectively in the spiritual work. So why does Mnemosyne connect heaven and earth, being the daughter of Uranos and Gaia? It's because this type of work memory, this remembrance of divinity, is the knowledge that we gain from spiritual experience, but also how we navigate our earth, our physical world. The two are not separate, they are integral. And this is known in many studies as the path of spiritual initiation, how we work practically in life and transform our daily life by remembering divinity. Mnemosyne is the mother of artistic inspiration, and she's also the mother of the 9 daughters, the 9 muses, with Zeus. This is very beautiful. For those of you who study numerology, perhaps the teachings of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism especially, understand that the number 9 is highly significant. Likewise, Mnemosyne is the mother of artistic inspiration. What art does she teach within us, metaphorically, archetypically? This is the art of creating the soul. Artus, meaning to join, to unite, like heaven and earth, like within a great Renaissance painting. The beauty of abstract symbols within great forms, pleasing shapes, human beings, great artistic creations that inspire the soul to want to study oneself. And then a muse specifically is an inspiration. Many poets of the Greek mythology or Greek traditions have invoked the muses to compose their great works and epics, like Odysseus or Homer with the Odyssey and even the Iliad. To muse is to contemplate that which is transcendent and pure. And really, work memory does that for us. As we're awakening our consciousness and remembering a superior state of being, we have greater inspiration and joy to move forward because we see the practical results of our work. There are some other symbols that are encoded within, such as this painting of Mnemosyne. She carries the lamp of memory. And for those who are familiar with teachings of Salman Vior, we taught about the transcendent nature of a marital union, of a divine sexual compatibility between husband and wife. The union of male and female. Can easily pick up on this image, which has a phallic significance, also that of the woman, of the yoni, the lingam yoni within Hindu tradition. And the source of real spiritual power is really encoded and found within the creative energy, which we'll talk about in a future lecture called Empower Your True Self. Here we just mentioned it in passing because the lamp of memory, of spiritual work memory, is deeply related to the use of our creative forces, because that light, the energy synthesized within our creative organs, can be transformed and used spiritually to illuminate our psyche. So the name Mnemosyne is also derived from the same source as the word mnemonic. It's the Greek word mneme, which means remembrance or memory. We even know it in our modern culture of memes, right? You see images with some brevitas quote to inspire some type of insight or meaning into politics or whatnot, such as you find on X or Twitter. So a meme or really the source of memory or remembrance is etymologically tied there. But again, the type of memory we're talking about is spiritual memory of divine realities that we've experienced. There's also some deeper truths with Mnemosyne. When supplicants would speak to the oracle of Trophonios, a Greek temple of esoteric mysteries, they would first drink from the fountain of Leth, which is forgetfulness. This is a beautiful symbol. In a sense, we need to forget our former ways of being in life, not from a sense of naivety or willed ignorance, like we're no longer going to pay our bills or go to work. In fact, what this means is to let go of our former sense of self that we were so attached to, that we're really the focal point of our life, more egotistical states of suffering. One has to forget that form of life and to adopt a new way of being, to let go of worldly thoughts. And then Mnemosyne, the fountain of Mnemosyne, is related to real spiritual work memory. They would drink from that fountain afterwards. So forgetting the world and then remembering the divine. Again, this is metaphorical. This does not mean we become irresponsible people who don't take care of their responsibilities. To just live like a hermit, right? Forgo responsibility or a job or a career or a family or taking care of one's loved ones. One can be in the world and yet be not of it. It's a psychological attitude. And Mnemosyne is precisely that, remembrance of higher transcendent realities and truths within ourselves. And so after drinking from the fountain of Mnemosyne, these initiates of the Greek mysteries would then recall their spiritual descent. They would remember the process by which they first had to confront themselves and how to overcome it. It's a form of spiritual descent to face oneself like Dante descending into Inferno, so as to rise up through Purgatorio and Paradiso. A beautiful metaphor and symbol. And work memory helps us to advance, spiritually speaking. When we talk about self-remembrance, we also talk about the divine feminine. So in a basic level, we may know from these studies that to remember the self is not to forget one's state of watchfulness. In a basic level, we learn not to forget that we are paying attention. We're observing our three brains that we discussed previously, our intellect, our emotions, and motor instinctive sexual centers. We watch our thoughts, we watch our moods, we watch our impulses to act. Now, primarily, that's the beginning. We want to cultivate that state of remembrance daily, moment by moment. But we also want to remember that which is called the divine feminine. Our inner being, our inner divinity has a derivative. This divine feminine, this inner goddess, was known in every tradition by multiple names. We have the Tibetan Tara, mother of compassion. We also have the Egyptian Isis, who is the priestess of Osiris, the divine father. Athena or Minerva, who armored the Greek and Roman warriors of the great epics, the Odyssey, and even the Aeneid. And also we have Mother Mary, Miriam in Hebrew, which means to raise. She is part of our true identity. She is the power of all of the compassion within every mother of the world. She is the limitless, pervasive, and all-encompassing strength and compassion of the gods, of all those masters and prophets, Buddhas, angels, whatever name we wish to give to masters. And she is within us. She is the power of our inner divinity who can liberate the soul. She's been characterized in these great myths by a type of relentless compassion and also terrible severity. You can even think of the Indian Kali or Durga, who slays demons. These are all very beautiful metaphors for an internal reality, our own Divine Mother. Our Divine Mother is the part of our being responsible for liberating the soul. Unfortunately, in many religions, especially Abrahamic, she has been extirpated from Scripture. She has been removed. And unfortunately, religions that reject the divine feminine in their exoteric or public sense are halfway to atheism, because no child can be born from just one sex, whether it be male or female. What is necessary is the union of both. Likewise, internally, our soul is never born from a man. Our soul is born from a mother who is impregnated by the spiritual seed or potential of the divine masculine. As above, so below. And so we want to evoke the presence of our Divine Mother, because as we're paying attention and watching ourselves, remembering a state of watchfulness, we also want to remember those qualities that pertain to her. A lot of people struggle with this. Many of us did not have perhaps a good upbringing. Perhaps it could be hard for some to identify with the divine feminine, maybe because one's main central maternal figure in life was contrary to the ideal. And so it could be very hard to try to evoke what it means to remember the divine feminine, especially if we've had bad examples in our life. I think a particular way to combat, or better said, circumvent that frustration or maybe doubt and despair is to reflect on certain women who have truly embodied these virtues. As again, we have these mythological figures, but there also have been many female masters who embody these principles. But regardless of one's physical sex, we all have a divine mother, the mother of our soul. And she is characterized by the most virtuous qualities of a human being and more. She is absolute perfection. We learn to cultivate a relationship with her by seeking her in our mind and heart, to evoke and recall a state of being without thought intervening, in which we know how to act in circumstances that are perhaps quite challenging. She is that Athena who guards and guides Odysseus in his battles. She is Mary or Miriam who raises Christ. She is the Isis figure of the great temples of Egyptian mysteries, who knows how to really lead and instruct. And she is the unrelenting compassion of Tara, who, when seeing the suffering of any human eye, outstretches herself to fight for their salvation. This is all within us. And we can learn to evoke that state through practices like meditation, but also self-observation. We observe our psychology and we watch our heart. How do we feel? Are certain states of being going to be detrimental for our life? And to observe and watch the fact. And when virtuous qualities or states of being emerge within our psyche in relation to events, we have to discern with our heart and act on what is most virtuous, because that is the thread that connects us to our Divine Mother, our conscience. This is what is known as filial love. This is what is known as filial love. The love of a child for its mother. We have here Jesus and Mary, as well as Krishna and his mother. Likewise, Osiris, Isis, and Horus, emblematic of the eternal triad, Father, Mother, Son. Our essence or soul is precisely Horus. the light of being that can emerge from the depths. Filial love is to have that state of consciousness in which we are inspired to act for humanity, for the benefit of humanity, for the well-being of others. That filial love is precisely a state of being. Self-observation is not enough. Merely to watch and get data about our defects is the beginning. But self-remembrance is when we feel the joy and inspiration of behaving and acting compassionately, even if it means being severe. So I don't want people to get the mistaken assumption that compassion is like the Hallmark card sentimentality of being a nice person in a conventional sense. This state of being is not contrived. It is not fake. It is penetrative and profound. And it's a state of love that can be cultivated, even if it means being severe and disciplinary and establishing boundaries. Love is not complacency with crime. Filial love, again, is that connection with divinity in our heart. And what we strive towards in this path is precisely to reconstitute the divine body of being. What we want is to bring back the diverse parts of Osiris. So in the Egyptian mythology, Osiris, the divine masculine, was dismembered by his evil brother Seth. Horus's uncle, who is a demon. This figure constitutes, or better said, Seth constitutes our diverse defects, egos, and desires, our psychological errors, which have dismembered our potential. And so the path of filial love is precisely fulfilled by Isis. Isis, the divine mother, has the precise duty to collect all the parts of divinity, the soul that is trapped within imperfection, within mistakes, and to free the consciousness. And by freeing the consciousness and extracting the soul trapped in each defect, we remember Osiris. We recombine all the diverse parts of our being so that we are an integral soul, a perfected consciousness, a master. What's unique about, and specifically in relation to how Salman Vior describes the state of remembrance, is precisely by evoking the state of recollection of divine being, which are precisely those qualities of strength or compassion, love, serenity, insight, spontaneous and novel, alert, vigilant, comprehensive, and profound. Those states of consciousness are within. And to develop a relationship with our inner divinity is precisely achieved through Isis, Mary, Miriam. To have love for divinity is to act on the best qualities in ourselves at the expense of our own ego. We want to renounce our own particular states of mind, which are problematic and cause pain. So we show filial love when we not repress our anger, merely suffocate and bottle it up so that it stews and ferments. Neither by feeding into that element and giving our anger and desires what they want, but comprehending and diffusing that fire with the serenity of love. This requires real strength. And that filial love we show in moments of great crises. And we remember or reconstitute our divine being by learning to renounce psychologically our attachments to behaviors that create pain, and thereby act upon real virtue. So it's not enough just to look at our defects and see how bad we are and to cultivate a sour and morbid attitude. That's wrong. Self-observation is necessary, but we have to learn to develop love in our heart, proper ways of being and virtue. And that only comes about by meditating also on not only on our defects, but also our virtues, that which is genuinely good in us. And it creates the harmony of our communities and relationships. So this is an interesting paradox. what is divine remembrance? We can say that, in a sense, memories of the past, as we explained. But what does it mean to remember the moment? We've talked about this in brief. Our memories constitute our records of the past, and oftentimes they can be unreliable or fluctuating. They change with different circumstances or bias. Oftentimes memories change when we look at them if we're not careful. It's very difficult to examine our memories without some type of identification, which we explained previously, to feel that we are invested in that thought or emotion of the past and to invest our energy psychologically into it. So while we want to reflect on our past and understand our perhaps traumas of the bygone age, but also our current moment, it's important not to identify with memory. Our memories also often project themselves into the present and cloud our future. We don't see what is new. So divine remembrance is not that. Divine remembrance of divinity, is precisely found when we do not have any artificial contrivance obscuring our vision. And that has to do with projections of mind, our egotistical states of being, thoughts, feelings, and desires, but to look at the moment and to forget the past, in a sense, and not to anticipate the future, but look at now. We remember the moment, not the past or the future. This is the fundamental paradigm shift that we need if we want to cultivate a relationship with divinity. It's also the basis of self-observation. It's important not to just observe our mind, heart, and body, but also in the moment, cultivate a relationship with virtue. This state of divine remembrance is mapped out in what we call the lines of life and being. The horizontal line of life, we all know. It is our birth, our childhood, education, teenage years, adulthood, even perhaps our marriage and family, old age, and then death. We all travel on the horizontal line of life. We all travel from birth to death. And yet many of us fail to acknowledge that there is a vertical path. The vertical path has to do with our attitude, our psychological state of being. It is intersecting with the moment in this horizontal line. We cannot avoid life, but we can transcend our suffering in the way we approach it. This has to do with verticality of being. This is not in literal space in terms of superior or inferior relations, like heights and depths. This is metaphorical, psychological. There are virtuous states of being and there are inferior states of being. There are the qualities of the superior essence, and there are inferior qualities of being related to the ego, defects, desires. Divine remembrance is now. It is involved in the way we interact with life and how we respond to difficult circumstances. Divinity is precisely in the moment. And while for a lot of us, it might be difficult to conceive or conceptualize that divinity is very close to our essence, it's important to emphasize a beautiful quote from a scripture known as the Quran. This is from Surah 50, verse 16, in which we find a teaching about how divinity is with us and is near to us, but oftentimes we choose to ignore that presence because we are identified or clouded. We are attached to our own desires. We did indeed create man, and we know what his soul whispers to him, and we are nearer to him than his jugular vein. Divine remembrance is accessible to anyone if we're willing to look. But if we identify with our own mind, we are disconnected. This is why the best act of worship in any tradition is mindfulness. We've included some images from diverse traditions that highlight the beauty of remembrance. In the Tibetan tradition, there are mantra wheels that practitioners would move with their hands to have them roll so that, in a sense, metaphorically, one is spinning the consciousness activating the soul, giving it power and energy through mantra or sacred sound. Mantra means mind protection, to protect the mind from one's defects. And in many senses, mantra, it has to do with sacred sounds or vocalizations, which some practitioners of different religions use different vocalizations or sacred prayers, mantras, to evoke good energy in the consciousness and to pacify the intellect, desire, and the body. This is so that the soul is more receptive and alert, awake and vigilant, and can receive intuitive insights into reality, but also ways to act ethically in life. There's also the Jewish synagogue here, where practitioners will recite Torah. Hebrew is, again, another language of mantra, sacred sounds, which evoke harmonious and beautiful principles. Church bells on cathedrals are also a symbol of remembrance, which is why when church bells go off at certain hours of the day, they are calling their practitioners to remember God. Likewise, in minarets, the top of mosques or masjids, you find adhan, call to prayer, used by singing melodiously in Arabic, verses from the Quran. And so these are all reminders to pay attention, to watch the moment. This is why Al-Wasati, in a scripture called Al-Risalah, Principles of Sufism, taught the best act of worship is watchfulness of the moments. That is, that the servant not look beyond his limit, nor contemplate anything other than his Lord, and not associate with anything other than his present moment. From the Principles of Sufism by Al-Qushari. This is basically summarizing everything we've said. Be present, watch, pay attention, but then follow your heart, your intuitive impulse of conscience. Don't look beyond what is not present to the future, nor contemplate any other state of being other or contrary to divinity. And that is something that you taste, and we taste again and again. We discern what sentiments in our emotional center or thoughts in our mind are constructive or not. And then we don't associate with anything other than the moment, not to daydream or wander in the intellect, to look beyond the present. So this is precisely the balance between self-observation and self-remembering. Self-observation is a balancing act. In a sense, it's like this violinist who's playing music. Beautiful music while walking a fine line in life, that line of verticality up in space, higher levels of being. Self-observation is like balancing yourself on a wire. It's how you use your skills to find equilibrium. You're watching yourself and being attentive, because if you don't, you fall. The same thing psychologically, in the sense that one identifies more or less with certain circumstances and may invest too much energy in problems. So self-observation is watching all of the processes of our mind and heart and body so that we can find equilibrium. And then the actual joy of doing that act is self-remembering. It is the state of love and compassion in which we are guided in our deepest core for how to respond to the challenges of existence. But oftentimes, like I said, we may feel disconnected. So this often has to do with the fact that we may not be looking appropriately. We may be too invested in one or other of the 5 inferior centers of our human machine. And this human machine maps us physiologically in our body, but also psychologically, because these centers is where the ego manifests. So perhaps we may be more intellectual or movement-based, maybe more instinctual or even sexual. Some of us may be more invested in our emotions, negative desires. And so we waste energy through these centers. We may be disconnected because we're too identified with the lower centers and not the superior two. So self-remembrance involves the superior emotional center and even the superior intellectual center. These centers do not allow the ego to act. No ego can act through those centers. They belong to the being. They're like your personal telephone or cell phone connection to divinity. It is how divinity communicates to us, through hunches in the heart and through insights in the mind. And these come like a shock of lightning, like an electric bolt, comes out of nowhere even. And it sparks us into inspiration and wakefulness and vigilance. So Salman mentions that we need to connect with these two superior centers, and that when we don't, we feel a lack of inspiration or strength. He relates this in Treatise of Revolutionary Psychology. It can come to pass that we are incorrectly related with ourselves. Accordingly, we suffer deeply due to the lack of inner enlightenment. Obviously, if the lamp of our room is not connected to the electrical installation, our room will be in darkness. Therefore, those who suffer from a lack of inner illumination must connect their mind with the superior centers of their being. Unquestionably, we need to establish correct relationships not only with our planetary body, physical body, and with the exterior world, but also with each of the parts of our own being. Oftentimes, we may feel pessimistic or doubtful. Many people write to us about feeling depressed or anxious, that they cannot remember God, or they feel that they cannot remember divinity. They feel disillusioned, in pain. What happens in this case is that we are often identifying with very strong egos. And so that's why it becomes necessary to introspect even further and to cultivate acts of giving, not merely of material things, but also perhaps sacrificing our time, serving humanity in some way so that we're not so identified with ourselves. But oftentimes people feel lost. You know, if we don't feel connected with virtue in the moment, then we become pessimistic, tired, exhausted, sad. We need adversities to change. But unfortunately, when hardships do occur to us, we do react. And we do feel disconnected, or we identify too much with our own ego. The solution is to accept the inevitable and to take responsibility for what we have caused in our lives. To look at ourselves, even when it is especially painful. Salman iterates these points about how some people may be inspired by hardship and others may crumble. Pessimistic patients, tired of so many doctors and medicines, no longer desire to be cured. Yet optimistic patients struggle to live. Many millionaires who lose their fortune gambling in the casino of Monte Carlo commit suicide, while millions of poor mothers work to maintain their children. Innumerable are the depressed aspirants who, due to a lack of psychic powers and inner illumination, have renounced the esoteric work for themselves. Few are the ones who know how to take advantage of adversities. So these are metaphors for psychological and spiritual life. In fact, when things are hard for us, it is even more important to attempt to remember the self and to remember divinity, primarily because this type of insight or connection, like a shock, inspires us to continue forward, to ascend the ladder of being up to the divine. Salman concludes this quote: during times of rigorous temptations, discouragement, and desolation, one must appeal to the intimate remembering of the self. Deep within each one of us is the Aztec Tonantzin, Stella Maris, the Egyptian Isis, God the Mother, waiting for us in order to heal our painful heart. When one gives to oneself the shock of self-remembering, then indeed a miraculous change in the entire work of the body is produced, so that the cells receive a different nourishment. So this is food for our soul. It's a shock. When we genuinely remember the self, when we stop forgetting divinity, and when we forget our pains and problems for a while. Divinity is always here for us, waiting in order to heal our heart. But it requires that we climb. Self-remembering, a remembrance of divine and virtuous states of being, helps to really change our psychology, even gives our body energy and enthusiasm. So we are always nourished in mind, body, and heart by connecting with the source of life, when we are looking at our mind for what it is and being willing to see the roots of it. To conclude, we like to reference a book by Salman. It's called The Spiritual Power of Sound, The Awakening of Consciousness and the Laws of Nature. There's some reference to how sound or mantra helps to activate latent parts of our psyche, so that by giving us good energy in meditation through mantras and prayers, sacred vocalizations, we have a greater impetus and enthusiasm, greater energy to work. So some of you may be familiar with other aspects of this teaching, like the runes, Nordic yoga, sacred rites for rejuvenation, mantras. These are all very useful for accumulating energy in the essence, so that it has the energy and strength it needs to be able to work effectively on the mind. So at this point, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. Feel free to write them in the chat. I'll read them off in the order that they're given. We have a question. I started reading the books of Salman Vore in April of this year. Shortly afterwards, I was diagnosed with autism, which made me explain why I have sensory processing difficulties. I experienced sensory overload due to heightened sensitivity. I can hear, see, taste, feel, and smell things others can't. As a result, I experienced physical exhaustion and burnout, which led to 25 years of addiction. I've now been sober for 5 years. I am thinking that if I learn to transform my unconscious and conscious impressions, start practicing sacred rites for rejuvenation, dream yoga, learning to consciously astral project, and practicing authentic meditation will be far more beneficial than studying books on sensory overload and synesthesia. I think one of my character defects is trying to veer me off this path and get sidetracked on this autistic awakening. What are your thoughts? There is benefit to conventional psychological wisdom. Obviously, there are things that we can study and read related to disabilities like autism that can be beneficial. But obviously, in your own experience, you need to discern what is practically working for you. So what we want to emphasize is that while the Gnostic tradition gives many practical tools and techniques that can help to transform our state of mind, it's also good to acknowledge, too, that in Gnosis, we don't fanatically accept or reject things. We like to study and look for the core of what is useful and practical. So if you find that there are some insights from sensory, overload or autism literature that can be beneficial, I'd say be open to it. But obviously, we tend to go a bit deeper in the Gnostic tradition by giving us exercises that help us to really go deep into the roots of our particular psychological conditions, whether they may be, have a physical diagnosis or not. So I think that, it's important to have one's foundation, which is our spiritual work, but that doesn't mean that one has to reject the insights of other, practitioners, such as from professional psychology or medicine. There may be things there that are deep that could actually help you. I'm not familiar with that literature, so I can't really comment, but I'd say keep yourself open to investigating. And obviously having your core practice is going to be the most beneficial and useful for orienting your life. Follow your intuition. We have a question. When we detect an ego of lust, what is the best thing to do at that very moment, especially if the impulse is strong? Any prayer mantra that is particularly helpful? One thing is to observe the lust in the moment. And oftentimes what can happen in many students is one feels an immense aversion, right? Because we know from our Gnostic studies that we want to understand and eliminate lust. But unfortunately, the tendency for many individuals who are practicing the creative teachings, the sexual teachings, is that they become immensely afraid of lust and therefore develop a complex in which one reacts towards seeing lustful desires in themselves. Now, oftentimes this can relate to repression. You see a defect emerge in yourself and then you feel aversion and try to push it away. And that's also wrong. We don't want to feed the lust, but also not to hide it or run away from it. You want to comprehend it. There are prayers and mantras that you can use, like Beililin, is one mantra given by Glorian Publishing. It's a way to reject negative influences, but also lust. It's very effective, but oftentimes you might be finding yourself reciting mantras out of fear, and this is ineffective. Fear does not make any exercise or mantra effective. If you're not calm of mind and actively looking and remembering God, oftentimes what can happen is that fear intervenes and tries to, repress or suffocate the desire that's there. And meanwhile, there's no comprehension. Beliline is a good mantra, especially if you want to feel more connected with divinity in order to invoke more positive influences. But be mindful that the prayers are only as effective as our concentration and remembrance, and that we're not acting out of paranoia. So I believe there's a teaching even in Hamlet by Shakespeare. Hamlet by Shakespeare, where my words fly up to heaven, my thoughts remain below. Words without thoughts never to heaven go. So be mindful and remember what you're doing so that the mantras are effective. If we're doing it out of fear, then it won't be. We have a question. Do superior emotions such as happiness, inspiration, and hope waste energy or empower the consciousness? Superior emotions empower the soul. They rejuvenate us. So going back to the quote we ended with the first conscious shock, self-remembrance produces a charging of our psychological and physical batteries. So we'll find that we have much more energy to work spiritually as we're remembering divinity. And so those superior emotions give us a lot of strength. They don't waste energy like anger or pride. They give us force. That's why we call this science hermetic sealing, right? If you studied alchemy or the medieval traditions of alchemy, where they talk about being hermetically sealed, it means to not let impurities into our mind, meaning we don't act inappropriately in thought, word, or deed. And by acting appropriately, consciously, with superior emotions, we give us more purity of influence. We feel stronger. We have a question. Does eating red meat awaken the hell realms? No. Red meat will give you fire. So we talk about in diet that different foods will give us certain types of energy. Having a lot of sexual creative fire from red meat can be a good thing. But if it's not controlled by our soul, then obviously if we're very lustful, then it could be good to diminish our intake of red meat. So I believe your question might also relate to indigestion. So some people have recommended not eating a heavy meal like red meat before bed, because that can cause indigestion, and indigestion can cause nightmares. So nightmares are obviously experiences in our own hell realms. And, obviously we want to avoid that. So it's good to eat light in the evening. We have a question. Can you explain why every time we take a decision to firmly move forward in our journey, things become more difficult and challenges multiply? Yes, because our Divine Mother is compassionate. A real compassionate trainer of a psychological type, or better said, like a trainer in martial arts, will give us the hardships and ordeals we need so that we can grow. If we don't face hardships and challenges, we'll never face ourselves. And so divinity intentionally gives us obstacles so that we can overcome them. And it's important to remember in this path that when problems multiply, we're given a beautiful circumstance to see ourselves for who we are. Likewise, we don't receive hardships that we can't resolve. Or better said, if we do receive hardships that we can't resolve, we will be given the means by which to face them. So it's a matter of our willpower and also our attitude. We have a question. Do you have any recommendations or ways that helped you on how to properly meditate on the ego or flaws without intellectually analyzing it? When I try to, I feel like I'm just using one ego to analyze the other. So it's important to remember, I think people have a misconception about meditation that we have to abandon the intellect. Obviously, in the deeper levels, you have to transcend the mind. We should not be thinking in the deeper levels of meditation. But Salman makes a very interesting statement in his book, The Revolution of the Dialectic, that we first need to understand intellectually the defect that we want to study. We have to have some base level of intellectual analysis of our defects. What do we notice? What do we see? How does it act? What situations provoke it? In what series does this ego manifest within a conglomerate of different errors? What types of situations does it feed on? Those kinds of things. That's something that you can intellectually analyze in the beginning, but the way that you properly meditate even deeper is developing serenity first. So we have to first develop concentration, the ability to focus on one thing and have serenity of mind, but also to learn how to imagine the particular scenes of a situation in which an ego manifested. So you need both serenity and insight to do so. There's a beautiful course from Glorian Publishing called Meditation Essentials. I recommend that you study that course because it's a very baseline, practical method of instruction going from the very bottom to the top in terms of meditation, how to really meditate on the ego. Without serenity, calmness of mind, and concentration, we won't have the stability by which we can have insight or perceive superior imagery within our visualization. So don't think that you're going to get it perfect one day, in the sense like it's just going to snap into place and then everything's going to work out. Like the practice is just going to flow. Oftentimes we do need to try and try again, because oftentimes we do get identified and that we're flawed. We can properly meditate on the ego and flaws, once we develop more concentration and the ability to perceive deeper imagery. So study that course, Meditation Essentials. It's a beautiful course, very practical. It can give you a lot of guidance in a sequential and organized way. We have a question. Any recommendations of mantras or koans, etc., to connect with our inner divine mother? And is the mantra cream a call to her? Yes, there are mantras. I mean, there's many given in the book, The Perfect Matrimony by Salman Vior, which can be used. One of my favorites is O, Ao, Ka, Kof, Na, Kon, Sa. It's a mantra that relates to the Egyptian mysteries, the divine mother Isis. That's a beautiful mantra you can use. There's also, one of my favorites is just Ram Iyo, which is symbolic of Mary. The mantra cream also works with the divine mother. She is the one who pulverizes any defect that we've comprehended. So the mantra cream is used to disintegrate an ego we've understood, whether through pranayama or through alchemy. We have a question. When self-remembering and being in the present moment in general, and self-observation, etc., is there a certain area of your body that you mainly focus or hold your attention on? I've heard instructors mention it's good to watch from the pineal gland. We observe from that focal point. We don't want to feel like we're driving our car, right? When you drive your car, you get in your seat, you have your seatbelt, you adopt a certain position, and in a sense, the car becomes an extension of you. Obviously, you want to remember your body. And one way you can do so is, if you find it hard to concentrate, you can also focus on the pineal gland, watching from that state, but also being aware of your heart. Those are where in our physiology, where the two superior centers manifest, superior intellect and superior emotions. So we want to remember and recall, you can focus on those points when you need to, but I would not get so focused on the sensation of the body, because that's just one source of information from our senses. We also have our psychology, our thoughts, our emotions and moods, and also the impressions and activities of the daily existence. So we want to be aware of all of that. One good concentration practice can be focusing on the pineal gland, especially if you're trying to develop serenity of will, concentration. You can hold your attention on that, or focus on your heart. That's another form of concentration exercise, where you focus on the beating of your heart. You might find that you need to do different types of concentration and attention throughout the day, because obviously our needs are diverse. Some tools are more effective for different people, and we might need to round out certain abilities of our attention and consciousness that may be deficient in us, where other people may have more development in that area. So that's why we have different exercises like concentration to help with that. So yeah, pineal gland and the heart, that can help.